There's something rather exhausting about the way most of us go through life. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to be likable to everyone we meet. We adjust our opinions to match the room, modify our personality to suit different audiences, and perform elaborate dances of agreeability to avoid the terrible possibility that someone somewhere might not approve of us. I want to suggest something that might initially sound shocking. What if your need for universal love is not a sign of your big heart, but evidence of your small sense of self? What if this desperate hunger for everyone's approval is precisely what prevents you from experiencing genuine love and authentic connection? Let me tell you about Sarah, a woman who had mastered the art of being universally lovable. She was the person everyone called when they needed a sympathetic ear, the colleague who never disagreed in meetings, the friend who always said yes to every invitation. She had trained herself to sense what others wanted to hear and deliver it with such skill that she rarely encountered conflict or rejection. And she was absolutely miserable. Not obviously miserable, of course. She had plenty of friends, a successful career, and a reputation as one of the kindest people you could meet. But inside, she felt like she was slowly disappearing. She had become so skilled at mirroring others' expectations that she had completely lost touch with her own thoughts, feelings, and desires. Sarah's wake-up call came during a dinner party where she found herself agreeing with two completely contradictory opinions within the span of 10 minutes. First, she nodded enthusiastically when one friend criticized a mutual acquaintance's life choices. Then, when that same acquaintance joined the conversation, Sarah immediately shifted to supportive agreement with their perspective. In that moment, she realized she had no idea what she actually thought about anything. She had become a human mirror, reflecting back whatever she sensed others wanted to see. She was universally liked because she had no center, no authentic self that might risk disagreement or conflict. This is what I call the universal love trap. It's the belief that being loved by everyone is not only possible, but necessary for a fulfilling life. It's the assumption that conflict or disapproval is always bad, that harmony must be maintained at all costs, that our worth is determined by our approval ratings. But this belief is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how love actually works. Real love is not a democratic process. It's not about appealing to the lowest common denominator of human preference. Genuine love is specific, selective, and often exclusive. It happens between particular people who see and appreciate each other's unique qualities, including the qualities that might be off-putting to others. Think about the people you love most deeply. Do you love them because they're universally likable? Or do you love them because of their specific quirks, their particular way of seeing the world, their individual combination of strengths and flaws? Chances are you love them precisely for the things that make them different, distinctive, maybe even a little difficult. But when you're trying to be loved by everyone, you have to sand off all these distinctive edges. You have to become generic, neutral, inoffensive. You turn yourself into the human equivalent of elevator music. Pleasant enough in the background, but utterly forgettable. Sarah began to understand this during a conversation with her grandmother, one of the few people who had never seemed concerned with being universally loved. At 85, her grandmother had strong opinions, clear preferences, and no interest in pretending otherwise. She was kind but not accommodating, warm but not agreeable, loving but not desperate for love in return. "I don't understand why you exhaust yourself trying to please everyone," her grandmother said. "Do you know what I've learned in 85 years? The people worth knowing appreciate honesty more than agreeability, and the people who can only love you when you're agreeable aren't really loving you anyway. They're loving their idea of who you should be." This was a revelation for Sarah. She realized she had been collecting what she thought was love, but was actually approval. Approval is what you get for meeting others' expectations. Love is what you receive for being authentically yourself, even when that self is imperfect, complicated, or challenging. The difference between approval and love is crucial. Approval is conditional, transactional, performance-based. You get it by being what others want you to be. Love is unconditional, freely given, presence-based. You receive it simply for being who you are. Approval feels good in the moment, but leaves you empty in the long run because it's not really about you. Love might sometimes feel challenging or complicated, but it nourishes you deeply because it sees and celebrates your authentic being. When you're addicted to universal approval, you cut yourself off from the possibility of real love. How can someone love the real you if you never show them who that is? How can you experience genuine acceptance if you're constantly performing acceptability? Sarah decided to conduct an experiment. She began what she called small authenticity practices. Instead of automatically agreeing with everyone, she started expressing her actual opinions, gently but clearly. Instead of saying yes to every invitation, she began declining events that didn't genuinely interest her. Instead of mirroring others' energy, she allowed her own mood and personality to show up naturally. The results were immediate and illuminating. Some people were surprised, a few were offended, and several seemed genuinely relieved. "I never knew what you really thought about anything," one friend told her. "It's nice to finally meet you." But perhaps the most interesting response came from those who were uncomfortable with her newfound authenticity. They would make comments like, "You've changed," or "You used to be so easygoing," or "Why are you being so difficult?" Sarah realized these were the people who had never really liked her anyway. They had liked her agreeability, her usefulness, her willingness to be a blank slate onto which they could project their preferences. But they had no interest in knowing or loving the actual person beneath all that accommodation. This was initially painful, but ultimately liberating. Sarah discovered that losing these superficial connections made room for much deeper, more satisfying relationships. When you stop trying to please everyone, you discover who is actually pleased by your authentic self. She also made another crucial discovery. Being disliked by some people is not only inevitable, but necessary. If everyone likes you, it means you're not taking any stands, expressing any real opinions, or being genuinely yourself. It means you're playing it so safe that you've become invisible. The people who change the world, who create meaningful art, who build lasting relationships, who live fulfilling lives, they all have something in common. They've accepted that they can't be loved by everyone, and they've chosen to focus their energy on being deeply appreciated by the right people rather than broadly tolerated by everyone. I think of artists whose work initially faced harsh criticism, but later came to be seen as revolutionary. Writers whose books were rejected by publishers who didn't understand their vision. Leaders whose ideas were initially unpopular, but eventually changed society. All of these people had to be willing to be disliked, misunderstood, even rejected by many, in order to offer their unique gifts to the world. This doesn't mean being deliberately offensive or inconsiderate. It doesn't mean disregarding others' feelings or being unnecessarily harsh. What it means is being willing to stand in your truth, even when that truth isn't universally popular. It means expressing your authentic perspective, even when it might create discomfort or disagreement. It means choosing integrity over harmony when the two conflict. Sarah learned to see disagreement and even dislike as information rather than failure. When someone didn't appreciate her authentic self, it simply meant they weren't her people. When someone was threatened by her honesty, it revealed their investment in superficial interactions. When someone tried to pressure her back into her old people-pleasing patterns, it showed her how much they had valued her compliance over her authenticity. This shift in perspective was profoundly liberating. Instead of seeing every potential conflict as a crisis to be avoided, Sarah began to see it as a sorting mechanism that helped her identify the relationships worth investing in. Instead of exhausting herself trying to maintain universal approval, she could focus her energy on nurturing connections with people who actually saw and appreciated her real self. But perhaps the most important thing Sarah discovered was how much energy she had been wasting on the impossible task of universal love. When you're not constantly monitoring others' reactions, adjusting your behavior, and performing agreeability, you have enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy available for more meaningful pursuits. She began to pursue interests she had always been curious about, but had never explored, because they seemed too niche or potentially controversial. She started expressing her creativity without worrying about whether others would find it impressive. She allowed herself to have strong preferences and opinions without immediately softening them, to avoid disagreement. In short, she began to live as herself rather than as a reflection of others' expectations. And ironically, this made her much more interesting and attractive to the people whose opinion actually mattered to her. This is the paradox of authentic living. When you stop trying to be loved by everyone, you become much more lovable to the right people. When you stop performing agreeability, you attract people who appreciate your genuine thoughts and feelings. When you stop being a mirror, you become someone worth looking at. But this transformation requires facing one of our deepest fears, the fear that if people really knew us, they wouldn't like us. We imagine that our real thoughts are too strange, our true feelings are too intense, our authentic preferences are too quirky. We believe that we need to package ourselves in universal appeal to be accepted. What we discover when we test this assumption is that it's largely false. Most people are actually hungry for authenticity. They're tired of superficial interactions and performative relationships. They want to connect with someone real, even if that someone is imperfect, complicated, or occasionally difficult. Think about your own experience. Are you more drawn to people who seem perfectly agreeable all the time, or to those who have distinct personalities, clear values, and the courage to express them? Chances are you find the authentic people much more interesting, trustworthy, and ultimately lovable, even if you don't always agree with them. This is because authenticity creates the possibility for genuine intimacy. When someone shows you their real thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, you can actually connect with them. When someone is performing agreeability, you can only connect with the performance, which leaves both of you feeling isolated despite being together. Sarah discovered that her most meaningful relationships flourished once she stopped trying to please everyone. Her closest friends appreciated her honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. Her family relationships improved when she stopped pretending to be someone she wasn't. Even her professional relationships became more satisfying when she began expressing her actual ideas and perspectives, rather than just reflecting back what she thought others wanted to hear. This doesn't mean every interaction became smooth and conflict-free. In fact, the opposite happened. There were more moments of disagreement, more conversations that required navigation, more relationships that had to be renegotiated. But these challenges felt alive and meaningful in a way that her previous harmony at all costs approach never had. Real relationships require friction. They require the willingness to bump up against each other's differences, to work through disagreements, to learn and grow together. When you avoid all conflict in order to maintain universal approval, you also avoid the deep satisfaction that comes from working through difficulties with someone who truly knows and accepts you. I remember a conversation with an elderly couple who had been married for 60 years. They laughed when I asked them the secret to their long relationship. "Oh, we've disagreed about everything," the husband said. "Politics, parenting, money, where to live, what to watch on television. But we've never disagreed about loving each other, even when we didn't like each other very much." This is what becomes possible when you stop trying to be universally lovable. You can have relationships that are deep enough to weather disagreement, strong enough to survive conflict, and real enough to include the full range of human experience. You can be loved not despite your flaws and quirks, but including them. The fear of not being universally loved is really the fear of being abandoned. We imagine that if we're not constantly pleasing everyone, we'll end up alone. But what actually happens is the opposite. When you stop scattering your energy trying to please everyone, you can focus it on building deeper connections with the people who matter most. Quality always trumps quantity in relationships. One friend who knows and loves your authentic self is worth more than 100 acquaintances who like your performance. One family member who accepts your real thoughts and feelings is more valuable than dozens of relatives who approve of your agreeability. One romantic partner who appreciates your genuine complexity is infinitely more fulfilling than a series of relationships based on who you think they want you to be. Sarah eventually became one of those people who seems to have a magnetic quality, who draws others in without obvious effort. But it wasn't because she had learned to be more universally appealing. It was because she had learned to be genuinely herself, and authenticity is inherently attractive to those who are ready for real connection. She still encountered people who didn't like her, who were put off by her honesty, who preferred the agreeable version she used to perform. But instead of seeing this as failure, she saw it as efficiency. These interactions saved everyone time and energy by quickly identifying incompatibility rather than slowly building relationships on false foundations. The people who were drawn to her authentic self, however, became the foundation of a life that felt genuinely satisfying. These were relationships built on truth rather than performance, acceptance rather than approval, love rather than convenience. This is what becomes available when you give up the impossible goal of universal love. You discover that being deeply known and appreciated by a few is infinitely more fulfilling than being broadly tolerated by many. You learn that authentic connection requires the courage to risk disapproval. You understand that the right people for you are those who can love you not in spite of who you really are, but because of it. So perhaps today, you might experiment with this freedom. Perhaps you might express one authentic opinion instead of one agreeable opinion. Perhaps you might say no to one request that doesn't genuinely interest you. Perhaps you might discover that the love worth having is the love that sees and accepts your real self. Because in the end, the question isn't, how can I get everyone to love me? The question is, who am I when I'm not performing for others' approval? And that authentic self, however imperfect or challenging it might be, is the only self capable of receiving and giving genuine love. I want to tell you about Marcus, Sarah's colleague, who experienced this same transformation from a different angle. Marcus was what people called a natural diplomat. He had an uncanny ability to find common ground with anyone, to smooth over conflicts before they escalated, to make everyone in a room feel heard and validated. Colleagues sought his advice, friends turned to him for mediation, and his family relied on him to keep holiday gatherings peaceful. But Marcus began to notice something troubling. Despite being surrounded by people who appreciated his peacemaking abilities, he felt increasingly hollow inside. He realized he had become so skilled at seeing every side of every issue that he had lost touch with his own perspective. He could argue any position convincingly because he had no strong convictions of his own. The breaking point came during a family discussion about a controversial social issue. Marcus found himself nodding sympathetically as his conservative uncle expressed one viewpoint, then minutes later offering equally enthusiastic agreement when his progressive cousin shared the opposite perspective. His teenage niece, watching this performance, finally said, "Uncle Marcus, what do you actually think?" The question hit him like a physical blow because he realized he genuinely didn't know. He had become so practiced at finding the acceptable middle ground that he had forgotten how to take a stand. His need to be loved by everyone had erased his ability to have authentic opinions. This is another insidious effect of the universal love trap. It doesn't just affect how others see you, it affects how you see yourself. When you constantly adjust your thoughts and feelings to match others' expectations, you gradually lose access to your own inner wisdom. You become a stranger to yourself, fluent in everyone else's language, but unable to speak your own. Marcus decided to embark on what he called an opinion recovery project. He began paying attention to his immediate, uncensored reactions before his diplomatic training kicked in. When someone shared a political viewpoint, he noticed what he actually felt before he started looking for ways to find common ground. When colleagues proposed business strategies, he observed his genuine assessment before he began crafting diplomatic responses. What he discovered was both shocking and liberating. He had strong opinions about many things. He had clear values that had been buried under layers of agreeability. He had passionate interests that he had never pursued because they might have seemed too controversial or niche. More importantly, he discovered that having authentic opinions didn't make him a difficult or divisive person. When he began expressing his genuine thoughts respectfully but clearly, people didn't reject him. Instead, they seemed relieved to finally meet the real Marcus. "I always wondered what you really thought about these things," his sister told him. "It's nice to finally have a real conversation with you instead of talking to a walking diplomatic statement." This recovery process wasn't always comfortable. There were awkward moments when Marcus had to admit he had no authentic opinion because he had been reflecting others' views for so long. There were relationships that became strained when people realized they couldn't count on his automatic agreement anymore. There were situations where his newfound authenticity created temporary conflict. But something remarkable began to happen. As Marcus became more comfortable with his own thoughts and feelings, he also became more genuinely helpful to others. Instead of offering empty validation, he could provide real perspective. Instead of smoothing over every disagreement, he could help people work through their differences authentically. His diplomatic skills, when grounded in genuine conviction rather than desperate agreeability, became infinitely more valuable. The difference between authentic diplomacy and people-pleasing is profound. Authentic diplomacy seeks to understand all perspectives while maintaining your own center. People-pleasing abandons your center in order to avoid any perspective that might create discomfort. One builds bridges from a position of strength. The other builds bridges by making yourself the bridge and allowing everyone to walk all over you. Marcus learned that you can be kind without being compliant, understanding without being agreeable, loving without being desperate for love in return. In fact, these qualities become more powerful when they're offered from a place of authentic choice rather than compulsive need. The transformation in both Sarah and Marcus illustrates a fundamental truth about human relationships. People can sense desperation for approval, and it makes them uncomfortable. When someone needs your approval more than they need to be themselves, it puts an unfair burden on the relationship. You become responsible not just for your own authenticity, but for managing their fragile sense of self. Think about how it feels when someone is obviously performing for your approval. There's something exhausting about it, isn't there? You can sense that your reaction has become more important to them than their own truth. You feel the weight of having to validate them constantly. You miss the opportunity to know who they really are beneath all that performance. This is why authentic people are so refreshing to be around. They take responsibility for their own sense of worth, freeing you to simply enjoy their company rather than constantly reassure them of their acceptability. They can receive your approval when it's genuinely offered, but they don't collapse when it's not available. The need for universal love is really the need to avoid the vulnerability of being truly seen. But being truly seen by the right people in the right relationships is where the real magic happens. That's where love lives. That's where home is.